Witnesses giving evidence to within the parliamentary precincts are protected by absolute privilege in respect to the evidence they are given to the committee. This means that a witness has full defence of any definitive action taken from anything they say in the committee. However, witnesses are not expected to abuse this privilege and may be directed to cease giving evidence on an issue in the direction by the Chair. Witnesses should follow the direction of the Chair in this regard and reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice where reasonable no authoritative comment may be made against a third party or identified. Witnesses who give evidence outside the parliamentary precinct are asked to note that they may not benefit from the same level of immunity from legal prosecutions as witnesses given within the parliamentary precinct. They may take legal advice in this matter.
Thank you very much. As you said, my name is Maura Farrell. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Galway in the west of Ireland, and I'm joined by my two colleagues again from the discipline of Geography in the University of Galway, Aisling Murtagh on my left here and Louise Weir on my right. So thank you very much. Thank you for having us. We're absolutely delighted to be here on, I suppose, an agenda that's very, very close to our research agenda, very close to our hearts as well. So thank you very much for that. And I'm honoured, I suppose, to speak today on a topic that really is of paramount importance to the future of Irish agriculture, and that is the essential role of women. For too long, we would feel that women's contributions to farming and rural life have really been under-recognised. But today we stand at this kind of a crossroads where the need for inclusion, recognition and support for women in agriculture is absolutely undeniable. Irish agriculture, as we all know, sitting here in this particular committee, has been the backbone of our economy in Ireland and our culture for centuries. And women have always played a central role in sustaining farms, families and rural communities. Now, traditionally, women's work on farms was often categorised as those maybe who help out or the women who stand in the gap, or they've often been seen as an extension of the domestic duties of the farm. Yet in reality, women have been active contributors, decision makers and innovators within the agricultural community. Today, women in Ireland, they represent a small but hugely vibrant proportion of farm owners and farm managers, with many driving advances in sustainability, diversification, and indeed the adoption of many new technologies which we really feel that we need. However, despite this thriving vibrancy, there are many barriers to women in agriculture. And some of those barriers are access to land, access to finance, and advisory education. And these are often much more challenging for women than for men. And many of these women face social and cultural expectations that can limit their opportunities. And this underutilisation of the talent that women have, it not only stifles women's potential, but it also hampers the overall progress of the agricultural and farming sector. So Irish agriculture cannot afford to leave women behind. And it is well established that empowering women in agriculture, it generates significant social and economic benefits. Research, including our own EU-funded FLIARA project, which stands for Female-Led Innovation in Agriculture and Rural Areas, has shown that when women have greater control over farm resources, they tend to add value to the farm and invest in their family's health, their education and their overall well-being. This in turn strengthens rural communities and fosters more sustainable development. In particular, women play a crucial role in driving farm diversification, including agri-tourism, food production, craft and rural businesses, on-farm education, workshops and organic farming. These farm diversifications not only boost economic opportunities and add huge value to many non-viable farms that we have in rural Ireland, but also foster more sustainable agricultural practices in Ireland. In truth, gender diversity in farming leads to more innovation and resilient agricultural practices. And this helps us tackle some of the greatest challenges we face today, such as climate change, food security, generational renewal, and gender equality. The action plan resulting from the National Dialogue on Women in Agriculture that we're here to talk about marks a significant milestone for women in Irish agriculture. And it provides what we see for the very first time, a clear and substantial commitment to ensuring the inclusion of women and the active participation of women in the agricultural industry. What becomes imperative here for us is that all of those actions are operationalised, and in turn they're evaluated to ensure that they are really the most effective approaches we can put forward. To sustain this momentum that is generated by this action plan, it is crucial that we implement targeted supports that fully unlock the potential of women in the sector. This includes improving access to mentorship, financial resources and educational opportunities. Policies that promote land ownership for women, ensure equal representation in agricultural leadership and create an inclusive rural environment are vital to achieving long-term meaningful change. So in conclusion of this talk that I have at the moment, the future of Irish agriculture is really inexplicably linked to the full and equal participation of women. Their skills, their knowledge and their leadership are vital to ensuring a thriving, sustainable agricultural sector for generations to come. And by supporting women in farming and agriculture, we're not just supporting individual farmers and the viability of the agricultural sector, we're also investing in the future of our rural communities and the entire nation. Gormina Maggots.
Thank you. So, Maura, I'd like to thank you and your team for coming here today. I think it's a very interesting debate. It's one that I called for. And it's great to see you here. And I think what you said at the very opening is the essential role of women in agriculture. I personally welcome it. I welcome the debate. I welcome the initiative. I want to start off by maybe a bit of a provocation in a sort of a way, in that I've always expressed a concern that even at the very heart of policy making here in the Agricultural Committee, in this committee, there are virtually no women engaging here. They're not on the committee. That's not to say there are many capable women with a great knowledge of rural communities and agriculture and agri-enterprise and food production within the Oireachtas generally. And I think that's something I'd like to use this opportunity to appeal to the people within these walls of this Parliament and the electorate generally. I think we should see greater representation of women sitting in this very chamber, these very rooms, involved in policy. And that's a matter of each party who has and we talk about quotas in politics, and we talk about participation and meaningful engagement in women, and somehow it isn't reflected within this particular committee. But this is a particular period. There's a new parliamentary period coming down the way. So I think that's what we should all exercise our minds about. And I'd ask you to use your power, your voice, to stimulate a debate within your organisations and within the farm organisations, who will no doubt be listening in here, because I think there's a challenge. And I want to see more women in this committee involved in agriculture, food and the marine, and the expertise of that. I want to first acknowledge the National Rural Network, Women in Irish Agriculture, the profile of great women, but great women entrepreneurs as well in terms of the agri-food sector. I think that's really, I want to thank you all involved in that, because I know you were very much involved in that, Maura, yourself. I think that's important. I think it's important when we talk about rural voices. I'm familiar with your Rural Voices online seminars that have been going on a monthly basis since 2022, which have brought a renewed focus on rural issues at a national level. And I think that's key. And what you're doing here today is key in terms of your advocacy here. I want to acknowledge the support of this initiative. I also want to acknowledge the support of Minister Humphreys, who is very much behind this in terms of our own portfolio of rural and community development and the National Rural Network and the synergies that's going on there. I also think it's important that we mention here Rural Voices was one of the first of its kind in Ireland, and indeed my own secretary, independent councillor who you were talking to before we met here today, Councillor Geraldine O'Donoghue, an NUI graduate herself in rural science and development, has engaged with your seminars and tells me of the enormous benefits that she has taken from it. So that's fantastic. And people can dip in and dip out of this, but there are many people, and particularly women, because the focus here is women in Irish agriculture. That's what our focus here tonight is. So, having looked at and read your statement in advance, and thank you for circulating that to the committee, there were a few issues that jumped off the page for me, and I thought the key issue that you talked about is the need for inclusion, recognition and support for women in agriculture. And the piece that I am adding to that is confidence, because so many women in agriculture, at all levels of agriculture, right up, and I'm talking about agriculture, horticulture, food production, food science, all of that, tell me of this thing of confidence. And you gain confidence by experience and more experience. And so I think that's an issue that you might just touch on. And I'm going to just run off a few points that you say in your submission. Women have always played a central and sustaining role in sustaining family farms. And you quoted a lovely quote there, for those who are rural amongst us would know, like, stand in the gap. You know, and everyone was a lad in rural Ireland, still is, you know, would the lads come and help, you know, stand in the gap, or would you help us out? But they have a meaningful role. And then you talk about, you know, the issues around the impediments, like what are the barriers? And my experience, the persistent barriers, of course, are access to land, access to finance, education, sometimes maybe the oldest, but not necessarily given this female, not necessarily the successor, because there's a conditioning growing up in rural communities and rural who the successor may or may not be. Now, there's a winding road and many things go askew along the way. But I think that's important. I think you've touched on something. We need a bigger conversation about that. And there's many people who would say, I was talking to a family member myself the other day, who talked about, Aisha, we don't talk about the place, you know, because we don't go there. That's forbidden. So I think they're just points that I want to take up, which I thought resonated very much with me anyway, and I understood. But what I wasn't fully aware was the female-led innovation in agriculture in rural areas, which is the FLIARA document here. And you might just talk to us just about that in a moment, just before I'll just finish up with a few points then. So I think that's an important initiative, and it showcases, of course, very successful women in agriculture and allied areas. But I think it goes back to that thing again about how can we, and I want to hear from you telling us as a committee, how can we do greater, you talk about greater gender diversity, which leads to innovation. And we must always be innovative, and we must be resilient. And how do we develop the resilient practices around all of that? So, I mean, really, you're pushing an open door with me personally. I think you are with most people here. But I think we need to this needs to be a national conversation and a national debate. And you might share with us also how your working relationship with the farm representative bodies as key stakeholders to get the message out. So look, well done. Hear what you're saying, loud and clear. My appeal to the bigger grouping outside of this room is we need to mobilise and ask the political parties and none and the independents, how can we mobilise to have more independence or more women in here in this particular form, because it's a critical form in terms of agriculture, and how can we use that in influencing the political parties and non-parties to make that part of this bigger thing about, you know, more women in politics, the greater initiative of participation, you know, and all that, because I think there's a real meaningful role and there's an eagerness for this to happen. So, look, they're just a few thoughts and you might like to respond. Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you very much. And some key ideas, and I suppose the starting point, it is, I suppose, for us driving this kind of an agenda, it is a disappointment that there are not women within this agricultural committee when we're trying to, I suppose, represent those women and make sure that they have a voice. But it is not unusual. We have found this in many scenarios where women are not represented within those agricultural communities, within those farm representative bodies, particularly at a level where their voice can be actually heard. So I suppose that is something we would like to pressurise, to in some way encourage here at this very high level, where we can see and it can filter down to other organisations and other committees down along the line. The FLIARA project, I suppose, is an EU-funded project. I don't know if many of you have heard of Horizon Europe, but Horizon Europe is funded by the EU Commission. So the FLIARA project is a €3 million project, and we're leading this in Galway. So I'm the coordinator of the project. Aisling and Louise are both working on the project with me in Galway as well. So we've got 10 partners across, we've got 15 partners across 10 countries in Europe. So we're leading out on this. So we're taking this exceptionally serious from an Irish perspective as well as from an EU perspective. It is an agenda at the moment that the European Commission are driving. And they're driving it from a policy level in relation to our CAP strategic plans. They have put forward this idea of gender within those CAP strategic plans. Our project, I suppose, it really is looking at the innovative practices of women in agriculture and in rural areas. And as part of this project, we've carried out 200 interviews across Europe. 30 of these we've carried out in Ireland, and 30 of them are in the booklet that you've just produced there a second ago. So that booklet shows 30 women that we have interviewed in Ireland, and half of those women are women who are driving innovative practices within and on farms. And what we started to see with these women on farms is we picked those women maybe from an economic perspective or from a cultural or social perspective, that they might have an on-farm diversification. As we started to analyse our results, we started to see that it may be an environmental project. However, these women are also having an impact from society. They're having a cultural impact. They're having an economic impact. So we started to look at these women and see the value that these women are adding, not just to the farm itself and to the income on the farm, but also to the broader rural community. So we're leaving behind this idea of maybe constantly harping on about the challenges that these women have, and looking really to what these women can bring to farms, to what these women can bring to rural areas. And I suppose even looking at the booklet itself, if you talk about the number of innovations that these women are involved in, and I suppose many of them that we've interviewed. And if you look at the wool industry, Bláthnaid Gallagher in Galway has come forward with some huge ideas in relation to Galway wool. Teresa Roach is an organic farmer, again in Galway, who has brought forward cheese making. We have a wonderful girl in Limerick, Aidan O'Connell, and she has 2 acres of land on which she has set up her own equine social farming industry. Like, I could go on and on about the number of women who have really added huge value. So I suppose we're coming at this from the perspective of these women are adding value. They're not women that are challenged and we need to help in some way. Yes, we need to overcome the barriers, but we also need to see and support them for the value that they can bring to these rural areas.
Cheers, thanks.
I'll turn to Aisling and Louise as well.
Thank you for your comments, Senator Boyle. And I just want to pick up on one of the points you made in terms of representation, and Maura dealt with it here. And it links to, all of these things don't happen in isolation. They're all very interconnected. So when we say we want women sitting at this table or in decision-making policies or even making decisions over funding, it's also barriers that will actually prevent the women from able to do that. So the childcare for the woman to let her come and be here. So confidence, it doesn't equate to a lack of a skill set, and it's not a confidence that can't come and speak here like us sitting before you. It's about having the soft infrastructures in other sectors that allows them to do that. But in saying that, while sometimes when we come to these meetings, we can always very easily identify barriers and these are the issues and we should have. I guess the message from us from our project is we do have tools. We do know the answers to some of these things. We have gender quotas, we have different governance structures that we can put in place, we have a newly elected member in Romania who is a woman, the first in her community, because in actual fact she and another mother took charge of setting up a social enterprise. So it's engaging other sectors like social enterprise to set up the community centre, and she then became voted as the first female ever elected in Romania in her community to become the voice. And she now is the spotlighted person. She becomes the champion for other women to show we can do this. But it is all the other structures that need to be put in place. It is those barriers that are involved in there. But just the take home from us, we have tools that we can do it. We need to give teeth to the measures that are put in place. It's within the action plan that is put forward in the Rural Agricultural Action Plan. They are there. It's just the measures and the tools that we need to give it the teeth to actually make it manifest.
Deputy Kinney? 10 minutes? Oh, sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, no, I'll just add a couple more points, just to kind of touch on and expand on what Maura and Louise already outlined. But I think the key picture, I suppose, to take away something that's rising up from this message is that women in agriculture are diversifying farms. And I think in our work for the FLIARA project, we've done some analysis of existing policy and particularly looked at the CAP strategic plan and the analysis that was done of needs within Ireland. And one key thing that kind of jumps out there is kind of a lack of interest with the general farming community in farm diversification and the need for education and measures around that. when you look to women and the successful examples of women that are running farm-based enterprises, they are the ones that are diversifying and that have the skills to run farms and rural businesses. So they really are kind of, you know, the successful people that are there are you know, amazing trailblazers, but there's an untapped resource there as well within maybe the younger emerging farming community, but also people who have left rural areas. So I suppose this issue of attracting women into farming to a greater extent can, as Maura has pointed to, it's a sustainability issue, but the issue of rural depopulation and rural jobs, if we can attract these people back that maybe have experience in other areas, but their heart and soul is in a farm. So there's so much potential that with measures that are even there at the moment, are women, you know, can they access them? Are the criteria too strict? So there's a whole, I suppose, body of work to do as well to ensure that the existing measures that are in place, are they, you know, designed in a way that allow women to tap into them to the best potential?
Deputy Kinney.
Very much. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for your contributions. I suppose, first of all, you're singing to the choir here. For many years, when I was 19, I put up mushroom tunnels and grew mushrooms and worked in horticulture. And I spent many years working with mushroom growers all through the West and down into the Midlands. And in a lot of those cases, they were diversification on the farm. And probably in 2/3 of them, it was the woman that ran the mushroom enterprise. I ran them very well because they had those skills of organisation, of bringing people together. They also were excellent at keeping the husbandry right, because you had to be very careful around disease prevention, around all of those things. And they were, you know, that attention to detail. And you know, I'm not saying that the men are sloppy among us here, but we have that tendency to be, you know, not as adherent, perhaps, to making sure everything is done absolutely perfect. And in that, I found that the women that ran those enterprises ran them exceedingly well, and, you know, brought a huge energy to it, and also proved themselves in their community, because very much a community thing, because they needed to get people from their local community to come to help pick the mushrooms, so they had all that as well. So, you know, I'm well aware of the untapped potential that's there within rural communities of women on farms that aren't, I suppose, utilised to the full potential that they could be. And also and you made the point, and it's a very valid point, that there's no women on the Agriculture Committee. I actually replaced a woman on the Agriculture Committee. Claire Curran, our TD for Roscommon Galway, was the Agriculture spokesperson for Sinn Féin, and it's only a couple of months ago she stepped away from that role and I took over back into Agriculture again, and it left a bit of a void there. But I know Claire worked very closely with all the farm organisations, and particularly had a focus on women in farming, because she grew up on a farm herself and understands and knows it. I'm interested in that issue of alternative or additional enterprises on the farm. And it's something that I suppose, coming from that mushroom idea that was way back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, that was developed. And it was very much developed as the idea was that there were small farms out there that were not really viable in what they were doing, put an alternative or an additional enterprise onto them that made the farm viable, made them future-proof them, if you like. Now, the problem is, and this is the problem that happened with that particular industry, was it got more and more competitive. Prices got tighter, things got tougher. Labour got more expensive as the society became more affluent, and basically it had to be the very big ones survive. There's only a couple of dozen mushroom growers left in the country now. There was hundreds of them at that time, with 3, 4, 5 tunnels each. The ones that are there now have 50 tunnels. They're large growers, and that's the only way they could survive. They had to get bigger and bigger, and the small ones disappeared. So in order to be able to keep, there's a vote coming up, I see. In order to be able to keep the farm alive, that was the idea. But the thing is, if you're going to develop, or if there's a way of developing an enterprise like that, on-farm enterprises, which women can be central to, and I absolutely know that, how do you do it in a way that you don't run into that difficulty? That you don't run into the difficulty that you can make sure that it's long-term sustainable and viable. Now, I see a vote has been called, and it's probably the voting block, and we're going to be a long time away. So if you can respond for a minute, and we'll rush off then. Thank you.
I think for me, There's so many different ways in which this can work, and I think, first of all, why do women get into this at all? There is an issue of work-life balance, there is the aspect of the viability of the farm, and I think women can look at that broader perspective of the farm and decide to take on something much quicker than the man on the farm, because it is the difficulty in the male diversifying that farm and the social and cultural thinking of the local community in relation to that. Whereas the women look at the farm and they say, we need more funding, we need more money, we need to put our children through college, and they will diversify the farm. Now, those start-up funds that we think really are needed via the LEADER programme or via the Common Agricultural Policy, those start-up fundings can start that business. But what's also important is the scaling up of that business. And this is where we often find that women run aground when it comes to scaling up, because there isn't that middle ground of microfinancing, funding, additional scale-up funding available to women. It is available in the broader sense to anybody, but for women to tap into that. And again, this idea, we've talked to many women who have in many respects gone to banks, gone to credit unions for increased funding for businesses and were turned down, based on the fact that they were not the owner of the farm, they were not the owner of the land, they were not the herd owner. So I suppose that idea of them not being the property owner disallows them from accessing that funding that's absolutely vital to scaling up that farm or scaling up that business on that farm. And we definitely found it's not in any way absence of ideas. And what we also found, and you know, you mentioned the mushrooms, and we came across many, many women who set up an on-farm diversification business and would sidetrack that business into 2 or 3 different businesses to make sure it was viable. So you could have a woman who's looking at accommodation on farms. Now she's turned around and she's also set up a small little coffee shop. She's also set up a production and a little shop on the farm. So she has many, many ideas to ensure the viability of that business. But where she often comes aground is that scaling up of that business and the finances to do that. So finances available for women on farms can be a huge problem, especially if they're not the owner of the farm or the land.
Appreciate that.
It's a very interesting debate, very interesting topic. I suppose if you go back in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, the family farm model was based on something different. It was based on potentially a husband and wife staying at home, rearing their family, going through the entire dynamic of it. And if you think of my part of the world, I think of my own mother, I think of Mrs. Brady, Mrs. Foley, like Mrs. Barry. That was the family farm model. The world changed in the 80s and 90s, and then it became a one-person operation in the majority, if not all, of those farms. And I'd say, without doubt, it was the male that actually stayed at home and actually farmed. So society totally changed, and the lack of the role model then became an issue. And like I have 2 daughters at home, my mother's still very healthy. Like the role model in farms becomes the big issue, to see how we can actually promote it and how we can actually make sure we can actually get women involved in farming. And my question is about what you said about the quotas. We have a quota when it comes to running in elections, 40% now, which is very, very helpful for the politics itself. The quotas, when it comes to things like boards of cooperative societies, aren't looked at. Things like ICBF, which were before us a few months ago, and I was very critical of them regarding their gender issue. They need to be looked at as a key driver to build role models, to be the person that then we can actually look at that, you know, is a driver in our society. So what can we do to make sure that we look at the quota issue for potentially making sure the cooperative societies, the march boards, all the way through to our ICBFs, to whatever else that's out there, and even to our department officials. We were blessed with our officials that came in from the Department of Marine a while ago, 3 exceptionally capable women, and I mean very capable women. But on average, we don't have that experience here. So do we need to be looking at the Department of Agriculture as well, at having a role in making sure that a quota is put in place to make sure we've women at the head of agriculture itself? Because I think we look at that word that you, Louise, rightly said, quotas. I'm really interested to see where we can go regarding that and what your view is about how we can promote the kind of role model, the leader in our community, in our society, that then could be the role model for my 2 daughters at home. So how could we actually promote that?
Yeah, thank you for coming back to it. I think it's a critical part for us that is trying to promote women in ag. I think there's 2 parts to what you're describing. There is the part, even if we put in the quotas, there's an issue that maybe the women won't come forward. And that's a social construct that we need to deal with. And that really impacts women coming forward and women ag anyway. And it's about identity. It's about, is it a female farmer? What identity does she have socially within that? And it's cultural across all of Europe, about a woman stepping forward into politics. Do I think it should start from the top? I do. I believe it should be from Europe all the way down to the bottom. But to go to the top, you should start at the bottom. So I think your quote is right at a local level. But there's different ways of doing that. There's an example of a campaign in Longford for See Her Elected. So starting at a local level, and if you see it, you'll believe it. If you see it, you can become it. And I think doing that. The other thing we do in our project for FLIARA, we have 20 female ambassadors picked from the 200 interviews. So there are women championing agriculture in rural areas, regardless of whether they, as I described the politician earlier, or whether it's an organic farmer or whether it's starting a social enterprise. There are women leading within their communities. They're becoming community champions. And it just breaks that iceberg that you're exactly showing. We also have, very interesting, you mentioned your daughters, we interviewed Hastings sisters who are influencers. It's a world that's younger than me, but it is important.
Very important space, though.
It's the media, the language, how we use it. So I think this representation thing, to get at that social element, we need a language change. It's mentioned in the women's dialogue. It's mentioned in strategic dialogue. We have to do that part right. We have to do the media right. And we have to build capacity. But it also comes back to another part. So we're all of a generation that is used to probably a patriarchal society, for a better definition of what it is. So maybe we need a little bit of open-mindedness, that we can just throw off the shackles of gender biases that we aren't conscious of. They're unconscious biases that we carry with us. Would we vote them in? Do we really believe they will? Because we haven't seen many of them. So there are so many strands to it. There's the training and capacity of other people to invite them in, to make that space. There's the quota space. There's the community engagement at the bottom level. And within schools, within the education system, should we bring it into the curriculum about women in politics, women in ag? So there's so many strands to it. As I said at the beginning, it's complex, but not impossible. We have models. There are approaches that we can do it. So that would be my response to that.
I suppose, you know, in thinking a lot about this, and we've thought about this ourselves on many occasions, and as Louise said, and it comes from a really, really good sports analogy going back a number of years ago, this idea, if you can see it, you can be it. And it's the same with agriculture. And sometimes when we think about farming, we've got to see the agricultural industry as a huge industry that's not just related to farming. And I suppose opening up the education system to show young girls in the education system that the agricultural industry is an industry that they can have considerable successful employment in. So it's not just seeing them within the farming industry itself, but also seeing them within the Department of Agriculture, within the industry of agriculture, within the machinery industry, within all of these industries that is related and connected to agriculture. That is hugely important. There's an industry out there in agriculture that we really should open up to young women and girls. And I think doing that will change the narrative. Doing that will allow these young girls to see, yes, this is a space, like STEM education, this is a space for young girls and women.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes hugely important as well, that we allow them. But I also think about the quotas. And I think disappointingly not to have a woman within the Agricultural Committee here. What does that say to young girls? It says that this is a very male-dominated industry. This is a very male-dominated space. And I think that is disappointing. If they don't see themselves within this space, then they don't see something that they can strive for. And I think this is a starting point for me to make sure that women are represented. And, you know, I think one of the opening speakers said there are a number of women in the Dáil who are from rural backgrounds. We know them ourselves. And I'm sure that they would only be too willing to sit on this committee if they were in some way enticed to do so, and can be a voice and can be a representative for them women within the agricultural industry or within the farming industry.
I can add a few more points as well. I think as well, like, if we can look to other sectors, I think, for lessons in relation to this as well. Even our own research and education sector has had a lot of issues around gender equality, and we have gender equality plans now within, say, the University of Galway. Most institutions of our type will have gender equality plans, and we need to have one to access funding as well. It's a requirement for Horizon Europe that we have to have this plan. We have to have key actions looking across our organisation. And that could be applied to, say, the likes of the agricultural representative organisations. But then you've got to ask, if it's a voluntary requirement, it has to be tied up to something like, maybe it's tied into funding, but also in terms of some of the research that we've done and the policy analysis. There was an example, I think it was in Italy, that they were bringing in some legislation to actually require private companies to have certain representation on boards. So it is something that can be addressed through, legal measures as well, if that needs to happen. And there's, I suppose, international examples of where that's starting to happen. If I have the right example to mind, it was more targeting private companies and boards more broadly. But there's a range of ways that if it needs to be something that has to happen in a very strict legal way, if it's a very serious issue, I guess that's when you bring in the law. But yeah.
The view that there is change happening, probably at a slow rate. I would mention, like, agriculture is a wide angle. I would mention the veterinary profession. I'd mention consultants when it comes to advisors. Even you look at co-op advisors. Just look at my own circle. Like, there is change after coming the last decade, but where you haven't seen the dramatic change is probably inside the farm gate. Like, the majority of my vets now would be female. The ag advisor would be female. Like, we'd have a range of people who are female, but the change. We've never recovered from the women that left agriculture in the 80s and 90s. My mother and her generation, Like, that's becoming the issue, trying to get that change within the farm gate rather than outside it at the moment.
Yeah, I suppose if you look, first of all, at the agricultural colleges, there are quite a number of young women involved in agricultural science. Again, we have a strong cohort of women involved in the agricultural sciences. And I suppose transferring that back to that farm gate. Now, we did look at, in the FLIARA project, we did look at the attractiveness of farming for women. And we did find that there is a sense of well-being, and I suppose a previous project we have been involved in, the ruralisation project, again, a European funded project. And we did look within that, I suppose, young people, what attracts young people to rural areas. And what we did see within the young people sector, we did see this idea of well-being being hugely important. And farming, in many respects, even though it's a very challenging industry, it can often be non-viable industry, it's also an industry that offers women that sense of well-being, that idea that they can work from home, that idea that in many respects that they can deliver a non-farm diversification or work with sustainability aspects, animal aspects, whatever they want, and tap into that well-being as well. So there's an attractiveness about farming at the moment that appeals to younger people much more so than it has in the past. So I think we're on that cusp of change, and I think you did say the change is there. And I think in many respects the Department of Agriculture do need to they should be given some great credit for the way in which they have come forward with the CAP strategic plan. We did an analysis on the CAP strategic plans across Europe, and there's only 5 of those plans across Europe that really took to the idea of putting in some measures in relation to gender. Only 2 of them actually put in specific measures, and that was ourselves here in Ireland and in Spain. So I suppose in many respects the Department of Agriculture really should be congratulated for that. What we need to make sure going forward is, we recently spoke with the European Commission, and one of the women from the European Commission talked about this idea of, she called it pink washing. So, and she was a woman from the European Commission, and she suggested that we just make sure that this pink washing is not going on. And we're not in any way suggesting that that's what happened with the Department of Agriculture, because we congratulate them in the measures that they have brought forward. We really, really do. But what we need to make sure is that those measures are stable going forward into the next CAP, that gender becomes part of the identity of the CAP strategic plan, and it becomes part of the identity of farming. So what you see now is that idea of a renewed interest in agriculture for women, because the policies are there. The idea of potential CAP plans and measures in the CAP are being directed for women. Let that be, from us, a particular, from our perspective, research perspective. The new EIP Agri, the European Innovation Partnerships for Agriculture, have now got a call out for women as well. And there's also measures in relation to the TAMs, and all of these measures add to the advantage of women being in there and using this, and I suppose being part of that industry. So I do feel that we're on the cusp of looking for this as a renewed interest for women in agriculture as well.
Okay. I think I'll have to suspend for a period of time till the voting block is over. My apologies, okay?
No, that's quite all right.
So the House, or the committee is now suspended. Okay, we're back in public session. You need to propose, do I propose? You need to propose yourself that you're going to go to the chair.
I propose that I go up to the chair.
Okay, agreed.
Right, we have 10 minutes each. Deputy Carol Nolan.
I'd just like to commend you all. I know I met you all earlier and spoke to you, but it's great to have you in here because, look, we need to pave a way forward and show that there is, lots of good things and lots of positivity happening around agriculture in Ireland. Unfortunately, women were airbrushed into the background for so long, for generations, but we are seeing a change. And coming from a rural constituency of Laois Offaly, I can certainly see changes, and I have visited the local agricultural college, which is in Garcheen in North Tipperary, and certainly there's more and more young women going in to do agricultural courses. So there is a change. And I feel that, the project that you're running is very, very worthwhile. And in fact, it's invaluable in terms of empowering women and in terms of creating a platform and highlighting all of the positivity. And I have been reading, some of the contributions from some of the women involved, and one of them being a constituent, Anne-Marie Feary, who's actually not too far away from where I live in Offaly. But there's fantastic things happening, and that's the only way that we'll be able to empower the next younger generation of women and pave the way forward. And I just want to commend you. I think you're doing fantastic work, and you're really, instilling confidence in women in terms of leadership and everything else. And there are barriers, of course, and we have to overcome those. And no doubt, in time, if we keep chipping away collectively, we will see a change. And I suppose I dip into this agriculture committee. I'm on the higher education committee, but every time there's a calamity with farmers in Laois or Offaly, I end up coming in here. So it's great to be in here today when there's positivity and there's not a calamity in forestry or anything else happening, So it's great that you're here, and I think what you're doing is tremendous work, and it's certainly very, very valuable, and will pave the way forward. We have seen many women taking up leadership roles. If we look at MACRA, First President Elaine Houlihan, I've met Elaine on a number of occasions, and no doubt Elaine will inspire her generation of women, young women, to step forward and take up those roles. And that's very important, because women didn't take up the roles, I think, for years. They just stayed in the background. Maybe we're happy to stay in the background, I'm not sure why, but it was the case that they were very much background operators, did a lot of work on the farm, but just not getting, I suppose, the credit or the the recognition for the work. So it is fantastic to see, and there is definitely change happening, and I wish you well with your endeavours, and certainly if there's anything that I can do to assist at any time, I'm happy to do that as a TD. So, Gaurav Magif.
Good, Deputy Nolan. Just sorry earlier on that we had there was votes on and there was an agricultural appeals bill on, so our apologies that we all couldn't be here when you were talking. Look at Maura, I know her for a long time. She's a good Montpellier woman. Look at, and you have spent a lifetime, in fairness to you, basically trying to bring forward ideas on rural Ireland, on sustainability, and on basically to keep rural communities alive. You've put, it's a long time ago, I don't know, we done a debate somewhere years ago, and you're, you know, more than myself, you're still at it. But one time ago, look, at women didn't get the credit what they deserved in farms across the country, even our mothers. I remember, and people would look at you now with two heads when you'd say they were boiling pots to heat the meal to feed the pigs. That was done. And if you said that to someone now, they'd think you came from outer space or something. But in your opinion, with the Department of Agriculture, are they moving forward the right way in trying to help women in farming? Or what would you say to the Department of Agriculture, the barriers that are now, and I know that you have your 12 proposals, but what would you say to the likes of the Department of Agriculture that's putting obstacles in the way that they need to help to get more women into agriculture and more involved in it?
First of all, Deputy Nolan, thank you very much for your good wishes in relation to our FLIARA project, and Deputy Fitzmaurice, of course, that overshadowing of women in agriculture has been there historically for many, many years. But I do think we are moving forward. I think we have made great grounds in relation to the CAP strategic plan and women being part of that. It is part of what the Commission are driving forward at the moment, and we have gotten great hearing from the Commission itself in relation to the work that we are doing. Some of the proposals that the CAP strategic plan have in there are quite technical. Other areas that maybe could be going into the future, you know, there's mentorship, there's networking, there's all of those areas that may be strong possibilities for the CAP strategic plans the next time round. What's most important is that we get these measured, evaluated. And in evaluating, we see have these worked or have they not worked, and that we don't turn around in the next CAP and throw out the same amount of measures again, or the same type of measures, without having had them evaluated and seeing if they've had actual impact on the ground in relation to women in those spaces. And in addition to that, I think what's also becomes important for us, and we've said for many, many years, creating policy or devising policy in the absence of clear research or data can be very, very dangerous. And I think at the moment, making sure that they have solid data in and around what is happening on the ground in relation to women, what is happening in the CAP strategic plans in relation to women, where are women feeding in, where are they strongest, where are they weakest, where we need to keep going with this. And having that data going forward makes our job as researchers in university easier. We can come forward once we have that data, and it becomes, for us, for researching those ideas, researching what the barriers are, what works, becomes very important. But to making sure that that data, making sure that we don't roll it out again without proper evaluation, that's also hugely important. We do have to commend the Department of Agriculture for getting this in there. There's only 2 countries in Europe at the moment that put measures in there in the CAP strategic plans for gender and for women. So we do commend the Department of Agriculture in doing that. We must also make sure that in doing it into the future, that they maintain that momentum, that they don't just see this as something that needs to be rolled out because it has come as a directive from the Commission, that this is something that stays on the agenda. This is something that we bring right from lower education to secondary education and to third level education to see women as part of not just farming and not just part of that, but there's a wider agricultural community and wider agricultural jobs agenda that women can get involved in as well. So seeing that from the department, but allowing the department to drive that, I suppose, with research and with changes in policy, for us is hugely important as well.
Have you seen, say, the likes of ag science courses and all of that? I presume as colleges you're analysing the number of students that, say, 10, 15 years ago were doing ag science. Is there an uptake from women in ag science?
There is a considerable uptake. There's a considerable increase. There's a considerable increase in women in veterinary. There's a considerable increase in across the board in those traditional male jobs in relation to agriculture. So I suppose we see that as hugely important. Are those women going back into farms? Not at the moment. What we're seeing is those women are broader in the area of agricultural employment, which is great for them. Are they going back into farming? There's barriers in relation to farming that are stopping that at the moment. Access to land. The whole debate around generational renewal is very much targeted at young males. It's not targeted at young females. The idea that the woman or that the young woman on the farm or the young girl on the farm can take over that farm just as successful as the male is a conversation that needs to be had in many homes. Now, we have an issue with generational renewal in that older farms don't even want to hand it over to males at the moment, never mind females. So we have that issue of generational renewal, but we need to make sure that women are part of that conversation, that the option is there for the best person to take over the farm, not the best male to take over the farm. So women need to become part of that agenda as well.